Hello, ladies and gentlemen of World Civilizations 1, and welcome back to this week where we're going to be focusing on some of the influences of Hellenism and the start of globalizing empires. Today, we are going to specifically focus on the Han Dynasty. Now, as always, we'll start off with our key terms. We're, of course, going to identify what a globalizing empire is. We're going to first look at the Western, also known as the former Han Dynasty. We'll look at the great Emperor Wu. We'll look at an important Han leader named Wang Mang, and we'll end by focusing on the Eastern Han Dynasty. Now, again, this is going to be very quick because you already have gotten a bit of this in my last video, but I just want to give you, of course, one quick reminder of some of your upcoming dates. Our first debate will be sometime during the week of October 23rd. You should actually have the debate time announced by now and be able to sign up for teams. Your content quiz will be coming up the next week, and your final essay bibliography will be coming up the week after that. So again, I know there's a very quick rundown, but please, if you have any questions, either view my last video or email me directly or join my office hours. In the meantime, one thing I want to focus on as we go over empires throughout the rest of the semester is the idea of whether an empire should rule through a stick or carrot method of motivation. For those of you who are not familiar with the stick or carrot analogy, this is essentially what it means. The idea is that on the one hand, you can focus on offering someone a carrot or some kind of incentive that is going to inspire them to work and inspire them to be loyal in your rule. On the other hand, you can use a stick to essentially beat them into submission and use some sort of harsh punishment or control system in order to force them to remain loyal and productive for you. Particularly focusing on the Han Empire today and the Roman Empire as well, every empire has essentially had to choose between how they're going to balance a stick and carrot approach in getting people to be loyal. Now, to define a globalizing empire, as you're aware if you've done the book reading, of course, is essentially just an empire that covers a huge amount of territorial space. So it's not just a territorial state. It is an empire like the one Alexander the Great set a precedent for that controls many different cultures and many different ethnic groups. So essentially you have to find a way, like Alexander the Great tried to get all these diverse people groups to stay loyal to you somehow. Now, what I want you to do, again for future assignments, is to think about how you would set up a globalizing empire and whether you'd focus on the stick and carrot approach. How exactly, if you conquer new peoples into your empire, how are you going to treat things like their language and the culture they had before you got there? How will you deal with their religious beliefs? Will you accept them, get rid of them, alter them in some way? What are you going to do with their former rulers? And how are you going to try to access the resources of this empire? Will you try to get them to give them up willingly, or will you force them to give up their resources? These are all issues that all these empires we will discuss for really the rest of the semester have had to deal with in some form or another. Now, to get more specifically into what we're discussing today, the Han Dynasty, according to historians, actually owes a lot of its success to the precedent set by the short-lived Qin Dynasty, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, probably not, which only lasted from about 221 to 207 BCE. Now, a reminder from what we discussed earlier. Why is it easier to build an empire out of the bones of a predecessor instead of just building an empire from scratch? Think of the Vedic peoples, for example. Why it took them so long to build an empire. Alright, especially for those of you who are into building, for example, it's essentially the difference between building a building from scratch or just renovating a building that's already there. Renovation, while there are exceptions, is typically going to be a lot easier. If you're trying to set up an empire, if you have a predecessor to build off of, you already have literally just the infrastructure and buildings there lying around that you don't need to build up from scratch. You can already have powerful and strong cities, roads that connect the empire, and things of that nature, while you also essentially can just copy the ruling and cultural methods of the previous empire. So essentially, the Han were able to take what worked from the Qin Dynasty or the Qin Dynasty and just build a new empire that served their needs. Just to give a bit of a background on this previous dynasty, they were the dominant city-state which emerged from the warring period in China's history from about 403 to 221 BCE. who were able to become successful due to their expansion into a rich mineral resources area and their participation in the Silk Road, which led to quite a bit of economic prosperity, as you would probably imagine. A couple of innovations they're responsible for that the Han were able to adopt to a certain degree. For example, their first emperor, Shi Huangdi, known as the First August Emperor, famously took the title of Di, or ancestral ruler. Now, why do you think this title is going to give him more authority? Why do rulers tend to try to claim some sort of ancestral connection or connection to the past? Alright, again, very good. Viewers hopefully watching this at home. This is, again, just another example of leaders trying to use some connection to the past to justify their current rule. If this First August Emperor can claim he has the blessing and has some connection to previous great Chinese rulers, it gives him a sense of authority and legitimacy with the current Chinese people. It's very similar to example to how pretty much every American politician today tries to claim some kind of connection to the Founding Fathers. They're carrying out the wishes of the Founding Fathers. They would have the blessings of the Founding Fathers, something along those lines. It's essentially trying to claim that you're going to call back or bring back the values of some great period in the past. The Chinese were essentially trying to do the same thing. A couple of other important innovations they practiced to help make China more efficient was setting up camaraderies, or 36 provinces throughout the kingdom. These camaraderies would all have a military governor as well as a civilian governor who is not allowed to serve in his home province. Why wouldn't you want the civilian governor to be able to serve in his own province? Again, for those of you who are paranoid among us, would probably be the first to figure this out. On the one hand, as other classes of mine have pointed out, this could also prevent favoritism in your empire from having a civilian governor prioritize the concerns of his own home civilians instead of the rest of the dynasty, but it also would make it much harder for a governor to attempt to rebel against the central authority. Most civilian governors would, of course, be more familiar and popular in their home territories. Sending them to other areas ensures that they're essentially strangers in the area and can't as easily form a rebellion. This dynasty was also quite efficient in attempting to register everyone at the age of 16 for taxation and military purposes, ensuring that you always had easy access to a strong military and knew who all you could tax in order to get profit for your government. Finally, this dynasty also was quick to establish standardized weights, currencies, roads, and writing systems throughout all of China. Why would these things be able to benefit an empire? We talked about this a little bit last time with the Silk Road. Excuse me. Doing all these in a day kills my voice. But yeah, again, this should be pretty simple since we covered it in the Silk Road lecture. If you have all these standard weights and currencies and trade systems all across your empire, it makes it much easier to do trade since you don't have to, of course, travel over rough terrain, but perhaps more importantly, you can buy and sell things exactly the same no matter what part of China you're in. Now, one thing I also do want to focus on is the role the Qin dynasty had in the state and education. At around 213 BCE, the Qin ordered the burning of all private books in the empire, except for any books on medicine and agriculture, that in order to have the education control have the state control all education. Now, hopefully you will recognize, why is this such a problematic decision? Why is it problematic for the government to get too heavily involved in education? For example, has this ever been a problem in America when the government gets too involved in education? Yeah, give you a moment to think on this. Alright, very good. Though, again, the paranoid among you would probably be the first to figure this one out. Essentially, what the government is probably going to do next is promote very pro-patriotic and pro-government education that glosses over any negative aspect of your history and encourages intense devotion and nationalism to the country. While I in no way want to discredit patriotism itself, there have been many instances in history that prove that blind devotion to any government usually leads to pretty disastrous consequences. For example, during World War II, the Nazi government and Imperial Japan both practiced state-sponsored education that focused on hyper-nationalism and devotion to the government at the expense of anyone else in the world. America has also been guilty of this at times. For example, in very recent years, Texas education books especially have sent out history books that refer to African American slaves as migrant workers arriving in the New World. This, of course, is extremely problematic, I think we could all agree, because it ignores the fact that most of these workers, if not all of them, were, of course, slaves who were involuntarily kidnapped and transported to a whole new world away from their homes. So again, this shows the problematic from some of the problems that was going on in the Qin Dynasty are still problems you have to face today. Many times when the state gets involved in education, it leads to pretty disastrous consequences. Now, around this time as well, the Han Dynasty was formed because, of course, as I said, the Qin Dynasty was very short-lived. Liu Bang, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, took advantage of various revolts and civil wars during this time period to declare himself the prince of the Han region in China, and eventually declared himself the emperor of the new Han Dynasty in 202. Like our previous Chinese rulers, he would eventually adopt the mandate of heaven and would portray the Qin Dynasty as evil. Why do you think he would do this? Excuse me. Still not used to talking this much. But again, this is of course another example of essentially using a theocracy to justify your rule. Instead of just trying to come in and completely ignore the Qin Dynasty altogether, if you adopt the mandate of heaven, if you remember what the mandate of heaven was, this would of course portray him as having the right of heaven to rule, and would claim that the Qin deserved to lose control of China because they lost the mandate of heaven. So it again essentially justifies your dynasty in taking control from the previous one. The Han were quite efficient in taking over this empire. They had an elite 50,000 army crossbowman army, which would use iron and bronze weapons, and a conscripted labor force which efficiently built canals, roads, and defensive walls all across their empire. A couple of things that set the Western Han Dynasty apart. The Western or former Han Dynasty lasted from about 206 to 9 BCE to 9 CE, excuse me, and quickly adopted and altered many Qin innovations to create their own empire. For example, Emperor Wu, who was one of the longest ruling emperors in history, from about 140 to 87 BCE, never actually personally inspected his troops or led them into battle because he was a strict Taoist. If you remember, Taoism believed that you should not personally get involved in political or military matters and just accept everything as the state of the world. However, despite this, he did have a very strict penal system, and in a year would prosecute over 1,000 court cases just in the imperial court. By 136 BCE, Emperor Wu famously founded the Imperial University. This is a university that primarily studied Confucianism, biology, and various forms of mechanics. Now, what are the benefits of a government in setting up a state university? Alright, very good. Again, the positive of this, of course, would be that you could have a more educated labor force and also a more educated government. Many government employees were required to go through this imperial university before they were able to be given any governmental positions. So essentially, the idea is that you have a more educated and prosperous workforce and a more efficient government. This university also was important in spreading the teaching of the Analects from 50 BCE on, which were a collection of Confucian teachings which taught the three main principles of the Han Empire. The idea that you should honor tradition, respect history, and recognize the emperor's responsibility to heaven. Now, why would these lessons be so useful for the Han leaders? Why would they maybe encourage them to invest more in this imperial university? I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking. She's very elderly, so hopefully we'll give her a pass. She gets agitated sometimes. But yes, once again, this is another example of using some sort of religious or philosophical teaching to encourage devotion to the government. Because if you honor the tradition of your government, the history of your government, and recognize that your emperor is ruling on the behalf of heaven, it's all used to encourage continued devotion to the Chinese government. Now, one thing I also do want to focus on a bit are some of the economic innovations of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty were considered in some ways to be quite merciful to their subjects, but they were also quite strict and used more of a stick approach, you could argue, in controlling economic support to the government. On the one hand, they would allow defeated subjects the opportunity to increase their social status after their former rulers had been defeated. This would, of course, encourage loyalty to the Han because people would recognize that if they were loyal, they were able to advance their position. However, the Han were quite strict in ensuring they had a steady tax revenue. All state-owned land was taxed, there was frequent tribute throughout the empire, and mines and the nobility and merchant and trade surplus was also taxed. This, of course, would be important to the survival of your empire because it ensures that you have a steady tax revenue and it can attend to whatever needs the empire might have. However, one of the more controversial aspects of this economic control was the establishment of price controls on things like silk and iron production. Now, for those of you who know a little bit about how economics works, what exactly are price controls, and are they a good thing or are they a bad thing? She's about 15 years old. She barks quite a bit. At least she's up and around. So usually she just sleeps when she's not barking. Poor gal. But anyway, essentially this picture over here gives away what price controls are. A price ceiling is essentially a limit to how much you're able to charge in order to sell a product. For example, many apartments in cities around the country have price controls on how much rent you're able to charge. A price floor is essentially the bottom, the lowest you're able to charge for the same product. Now, these, of course, it's debatable on whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. More laissez-faire or conservative economics would probably argue that having too much control on the economy limits competition and limits personal freedom. If I'm not able to charge what I want to charge and the government controls and doesn't let me compete with other people, it arguably could lead to economic stagnation and just can kill the industry. More liberal economists and people who are less fans of a total free market would argue that this gives the public guaranteed access to important products. For example, as we mentioned last time, silk, of course, was an extremely important product for the Silk Road, and iron production is, of course, at this time going to be used for just about every product you could ever imagine. So by having these price controls, it prevents powerful industries from raising the prices to such a degree that people can't afford them, but it also prevents the prices from getting so low that there will no longer be any profit and no one's willing to produce these products anymore. So essentially, this just leads to a big debate over people who favor whether people should favor strong stick-leveled or stick-centered, economic policies. Do you want the government to control the economy and potentially make it more fair and accessible, or do you want it to be more free to hopefully encourage innovation and competition? This is something the Han Dynasty had to wrestle with, which did lead to some complications for them. Before we get into that, though, I do want to look a little bit at the Han social hierarchy. In reality, the Han social hierarchy, was very similar to other things we've already looked at. It is so hard to concentrate with my dog's barking, I apologize. But yeah, the social hierarchy was essentially the same thing we've already looked at. The imperial court was at the top. You'd have high-ranking officers or officials and scholars below them. You'd go down to the merchants, local rulers, small farmers, slaves, and private slaves and convicts. However, the Han Dynasty was also very efficient in attempting to promote an agrarian ideal, which you can see here. In Confucius and Taoist teachings, they would specifically praise peasants and farmers for their agrarian work effort and for their pureness in working with the land, and criticize merchants who did not work with the land and did not use physical labor. What do you think the purpose is of promoting this agrarian ideal that clearly seems to go against reality? Give me a moment. I'm just looking at what she's barking at. She's barking at nothing. Poor old dog. I love her so much. Her name's Sally, by the way, for anyone who's curious. She's a big black lab, so if she doesn't destroy anything, maybe I'll bring her in to show her off on camera one day. But not today. But as you might imagine, this is a very similar ideal to, for example, Thomas Jefferson's yeoman farmer ideal that was very popular in early America. Essentially, it's a way to try to promote these peasants and farmers, who are, of course, necessary for your economy to survive, to motivate them to try to still be productive, despite the fact that in reality, they're really not getting much of a benefit from this economic system. So instead of benefiting them in reality, you have to convince them that the ancestral ideals of your country would promote this kind of lifestyle. Now, to get a little bit more to the successes of the Han Dynasty, they were quite militarily successful. Despite the Emperor Wu himself not getting directly involved in the military was quite large. Military service was compulsory at this time. This led to about 100,000 soldiers constantly being stationed in the capital, and about a 1 million standing army across the entire dynasty. Now, a compulsory army, of course, is when you have army service become mandatory. Is that a good idea? And is it something that modern militaries should copy? Alright, this, of course, as you might imagine, is another hotly debated topic that is not going anywhere anytime soon. Some people, for example, would point to the success of the Israeli military and argue that having a compulsory military encourages devotion and patriotism and involvement in the civic process and in defending your country. Other people, of course, believe that serving the military should be a choice, and that forcing people to fight on behalf of the country can lead to all sorts of devastating wars and military conflicts that people might otherwise not participate in. So again, this is another hotly debated issue that is nothing new. However, in terms of Han territory and Han's success, this military was extremely efficient. For example, by the height of the Western Dynasty, Han territory spread all the way from southeastern China down to modern-day Vietnam. Governors were also eventually established in Korea by invitation, actually, because the Han Dynasty was seen as being so successful. By 135 BCE, a camaraderie was established in Sichuan, and by 120 BCE, the Chinese had expelled the last of these Xiongnu invaders that we talked about last time, and had essentially taken over most of their territory and completely expelled all invaders from it. However, this stick-on approach to the economy that I mentioned earlier is eventually credited as being what led to the downfall of the Western Dynasty. So, what I'd like you to do, once you get a chance, is watch this YouTube video where Ron Swanson from Parks and Recreation illustrates some of the common problems people have with taxation. After you view that, consider for yourself some of the reasons taxes could lead to a collapse of the government, and debate a bit over whether taxation is actually necessary. Many libertarians, for example, of course, consider all taxation to be some sort of theft. Again, once you get a chance to do that, we'll go ahead and move on. Now, this mandatory taxation did, of course, lead to many problems for the Han. Natural disasters and crop failures made this tax burden worse, because, of course, many people aren't going to be producing many crops during this time. However, despite this, the Han tax system was based not on the crop yield size you had per year, but on the size of the land holding. No matter what happened with your crops, however much land you had, it determined what tax was expected. Why might this be such a bad idea for the Han? Think about, again, what's going on with these natural disasters. Again, this is what is going to probably seem fairly obvious. It's, again, sort of the cons of having a flat rate tax system over having some sort of variable tax system. And, having a tax system based on land holding isn't going to be a bad thing when the crop yield is good, but there's no adjustments and forgiveness if circumstances outside of your control limit the crops you're going to produce. So, of course, during times of hardship, people are going to get upset by these taxes because they can't pay them. Because of this, Wang Mang eventually took control of the Han Dynasty from about 9 to 23 CE, who claimed that he now had the mandate of heaven and started his whole new dynasty. In this dynasty, he specifically would confiscate gold and other wealth from wealthy landowners and merchants and redistribute it and the land and establish communal garden plots. Now, is this going to be a good idea and an efficient government system? Give me a moment. I'm really starting to lose my voice at this point. I'll just sort of stare at this guy's face, I guess, while I wait for an imaginary response. Yeah, as you can see here, essentially what he's trying to do is take advantage and gain the support of the disenfranchised in the Han Dynasty and try to more equally spread resources and wealth throughout the empire and not just have it all go straight to the government. As you might imagine, establishing communal garden plots where the profit doesn't go to the owners necessarily is not going to be a very popular decision. This, of course, led to the collapse of his dynasty and the start of what is known as the Eastern Han Dynasty, which lasted from about 25 to 220 BCE. In 11 CE, the Yellow River changed course and flooded huge portions of the Han territory and essentially affected about half of China's population at the time. This led to an increasing dislike of Meng's policies and led to him being overthrown in 25 CE. Interestingly enough, I think the rebels called themselves the Red Eyebrows, which I think, of course, is fascinating. Due to the failures of Wang Mang and the Western Han Dynasty, the Eastern Han Dynasty practiced a much more hands-off and more carrot-based approach to the economy. They essentially did not have very heavy taxes and weren't very big in registering people. They allowed local lords and merchants to amass wealth themselves without much interference from the government. This, of course, led to lower taxes across the empire. On the one hand, the elites and local merchants were able to amass much more private land and amass great amounts of wealth, but this did lead to higher rents across the country and greater social inequality because there was no regulation on how much wealth could be amassed by one person or one business. Now, this of course leads to another big economic debate. Is this system better or worse than what the West Dynasty had? Because on the one hand, with the Western Dynasty, you have a dynasty that's leading to humongous taxes no matter what, and is leading to a heavy tax burden that the population really can't keep up. On the other hand, you have a dynasty that isn't really taxing anyone at all and is not regulating the economy to any major degree, but is allowing local lords and local merchants to amass so much wealth that there's huge economic inequality across the country. So this essentially leads to the big debate over how we should handle an economy. Should the government get heavily involved and potentially overtax the population, or should the government heavily back off of the economy and potentially allow various various businesses and corporations eventually to amass a great deal of wealth? This, of course, is a great debate, and as you can see in modern economic and presidential debates, is not really anything that's probably going to be resolved anytime soon. However, just to sort of wrap things up for us on the state of China at this point, by 184 CE, the Yellow Turbans and other various groups had rebelled because they wanted a more just and idyllic society where wealth was more evenly distributed. The empire was able to ultimately defeat the Yellow Turbans, but they were ultimately unable to reestablish control over the dynasty because there was a huge mass refusal of citizens to pay any taxes or to participate in any labor. So again, based off of this, which is a more effective system of ruling, particularly focusing on the autonomy this time? Should you focus on the stick and force heavy tax participation, or focus on a more carrot approach and have a hands-off system that rewards people for economic participation? Which of these, in the Han's case, do you think proved most effective? But in the meantime, that's all I really have for you this time. Remember your upcoming assignments, and please do let me know if you have any major questions. Thank you, and have a great rest of your week.